10 years of service, 25 lashes for disobedience, one rule for survival: never sleep alone. Rome's legions didn't buy loyalty with gold. They forged it in sweat, hunger, and flesh. Every embrace beneath a woolen cloak was a transaction. Every moan, a tax in the ledger of obedience. Who paid for Rome's glory? And with what body? Chronicles speak of valor. Archaeology and letters speak of longing. If you value the record, subscribe. When the ledger closes, the bones still speak. It begins not with the clash of swords, but in the silence between them. Year 117 CE. The Emperor Trajan is dead. His armies stretch from the forests of Britannia to the sands of Mesopotamia. 500,000 men, each sworn to serve 25 years under a single, merciless oath. Inside a fortress on the Danube, 5,000 soldiers live in perfect order and perfect loneliness. They rise at dawn, march at dusk, and eat in silence. Discipline is absolute. Desire is forbidden. But the human body does not obey the same law as the empire. A Roman camp was a machine, every tent placed with geometric precision, every rank defined by privilege. Yet, within that machinery, life pulsed in secret. Letters unearthed at Vindolanda, carved graffiti from Dura Europos, and faded inscriptions on tombs reveal what the official chronicles never dared to record. In the cold nights of Germania or the Syrian desert heat, men reached for warmth, not from fire, but from one another. The legions were a world without women. Rome's moral code demanded purity, yet its survival depended on cohesion. The generals could command armies, but not loneliness. So, between sleeping mats and shared cloaks, a different order formed, one built on affection, mentorship, and silent trust. Veterans taught recruits how to fight, how to march, and how to endure the terror of war. But the line between mentorship and intimacy was thin. A centurion's hand that once corrected a sword grip might linger a heartbeat too long. A word of praise became something heavier, unspoken, yet understood. Rome called these bonds fraternal loyalty. Archaeology calls them what they were: survival through intimacy. Every shared night preserved morale. Every secret attachment turned two men into a single fighting unit, a bond so fierce that commanders began to notice something inconvenient. Soldiers who loved each other fought harder, longer, and died without retreat. The empire, ever pragmatic, looked away. Love, when properly disciplined, became useful. It was loyalty sharpened into instinct. So, when we speak of Rome's legendary discipline, we must ask, was it built on law or on longing? In the heart of the most ordered army in history, chaos survived, not in rebellion, but in tenderness. The official annals celebrate victories, but the letters tell another story, of soldiers who called each other sweetheart, of men who kissed before battle, of affection carved into stone beside the eagle standard. Because Rome, the master of the world, learned one truth no law could erase. Even the most obedient body still yearns to be held. A Roman fortress was not a home, it was a machine, a grid of order and obedience built to erase individuality. Every stone, every tent, every heartbeat inside its walls belonged to the state. From the outside, a castra looked like perfection. High ramparts, straight roads, and towers aligned to the cardinal points. To Rome, this geometry was sacred, symmetry as proof of civilization. But inside, life was a symphony of exhaustion. The air smelled of oil, sweat, iron, and cooked grain. The clang of hammers and the rhythm of drills never stopped. Soldiers rose before sunrise, washed in icy water, ate barley porridge, and began another day of repetition so absolute that even thought became mechanical. There were no wives, no laughter of children, no privacy. 5,000 men lived shoulder to shoulder in long wooden barracks, 20 per room, sleeping on straw pallets, shields stacked like doors between them. When the snow came, they burned dried dung for heat. When summer arrived, the air turned into dust and salt. In those seasons of deprivation, the line between duty and despair blurred quickly. The army forbade marriage for active soldiers, fearing distraction and inheritance disputes. Their only family was each other. To survive, men created a second kind of kinship, unofficial, emotional, and physical. What began as camaraderie deepened into attachment. Every fortress had its rhythms, training by day, silence by night, and between those hours, the rituals that held men together. They wrote letters to distant families they might never see again. They shared stolen wine. They patched each other's wounds. And sometimes they shared more. The kind of closeness Rome's laws refused to name. Archaeology gives us fragments of that hidden world. A wooden tablet discovered at Vindolanda, written around 100 CE, contains the words of a soldier named Lucius to a companion he calls "my dearest." He speaks not of battle, but of loneliness. Another inscription from a fort in Pannonia reads simply, "Under the eagles of Rome, Gaius found in Marcus not a brother, but the fire that turns fear into courage." Historians once dismissed such phrases as metaphors for friendship. But when dozens of similar inscriptions appear across the empire, from Britain to Syria, the pattern is impossible to ignore. These were not isolated emotions. They were the emotional infrastructure of Rome's military power. In a world where every emotion had to serve a function, desire became discipline. The legions learned to weaponize affection. Two soldiers who loved each other would never abandon their post. Their loyalty was absolute, because it was no longer to Rome. It was to the man beside them. The commanders, pragmatic as ever, understood this quietly. No decree was written, but tolerance spread like policy. In the long winter campaigns, generals allowed pairs of men to share tents. When questioned, they called it efficiency. When intimacy produced valor, Rome simply counted it as victory. But the balance was delicate. Public displays were forbidden. Honor depended on hierarchy. The senior partner, active and dominant, preserved his dignity. The younger, passive one sacrificed it temporarily, earning protection and mentorship in return. Within that structure, desire became law without ever being written down. This unwritten code had clear consequences. A centurion might take a recruit under his wing, training him, shielding him, even risking punishment for him. The bond blurred the line between command and care. When that centurion died, the recruit often took responsibility for the funeral rites, paying from his own savings for an inscription or an offering. Many tombstones bear two names, one official, one personal. The living dedicating stone to the dead as beloved companion in war and peace. Rome called such devotion brotherhood. The Church centuries later would call it sin. Yet in the Empire's most efficient killing machine, it was the glue that kept men from collapsing under the weight of endless conquest. Still, not all intimacy was equal. There were abuses, superiors coercing subordinates, exploiting power under the veil of affection. The line between protection and possession was thin. Some soldiers resisted, others submitted for safety or advancement. The Lex Julia de Vi Publica theoretically punished sexual coercion, but, in practice, justice depended entirely on the commander's whim. The fortress was not a court, it was a closed world where silence was survival. So the system evolved. Affection was tolerated, exploitation ignored. As long as the legions marched and the empire expanded, morality was negotiable. Night in the Castra was the empire's truest mirror. Between torchlight and darkness, men whispered the only prayers Rome could not censor, promises of return, of shared warmth, of being remembered. In those moments, the empire's ideals of honor and virtue gave way to something rawer, more human. The next morning, they would rise, polish their armor, and march in perfect formation, as if nothing sacred had passed between them. But the letters, graffiti, and bones buried in soldiers' graves tell otherwise. Rome's power was not sustained by marble, but by bodies, intertwined, disciplined, and obedient. And that obedience came with a price. To love meant to serve. To serve meant to surrender ownership of one's own body to the empire. In that paradox between desire and duty, Rome found its greatest military innovation. It discovered that the most loyal army is not one bound by fear, but one bound by affection. In the most disciplined army the world had ever known, loyalty was more than a matter of obedience. It was a matter of flesh. To serve in Rome's legions was to swear loyalty not only to the emperor, but to one's comrades. But loyalty, in its purest form, required more than just shared hardship. It demanded a personal bond, a connection that went beyond the rigors of training and the cold strategies of warfare. The relationship between veteran and recruit was the foundation upon which Rome built its strength. In a system where every soldier was a cog in the empire's machine, the bond between these two men was the oil that kept the machine running smoothly. But as this relationship evolved, it became something more than just mentorship. It became a rite, an act of intimacy that Rome both tolerated and nurtured, because it kept the legions together and forged a loyalty stronger than any sword. The centurion was the key figure in this dynamic. In the early days of a recruit's service, his mentor, the centurion, was both his teacher and protector. It was the centurion's responsibility to instill in the young recruit the necessary skills for survival. But survival, in the empire's eyes, was not just about fighting. It was about belonging. To truly belong, a recruit had to submit to the centurion's care, and sometimes to his touch. In the barracks, where silence reigned after the day's drills, the mentorship between these two men took on a different form. For the recruit, the centurion was not just a figure of authority. He was an ideal. The older man was the embodiment of Roman strength, honor, and experience. For the centurion, the recruit was an investment. The young soldier would become the future of the legions, and a successful centurion would see his protege become a trusted companion in battle. In the shadows of the fort, beneath the cold moonlight, what started as guidance became affection. The centurion, after years of service, had nothing left to prove. But in a world where soldiers fought, lived, and died for each other, the emotional connection between them took on new meaning. The older man would take the younger soldier under his wing, teaching him the ways of battle, but also teaching him the ways of Rome. The Romans were a society governed by strict rules, and they saw sexual intimacy through a different lens. What mattered was not who a person slept with, but what role they played in the act. The active partner in the relationship retained his status. The passive partner, the one who submitted, did not lose his honor, as long as he was a recruit learning from his mentor. This distinction was not just about sex, it was about power. In Rome, power was always in the hands of the active. The mentor would dominate, physically and emotionally, in a way that reinforced his position of authority. But for the recruit, this was not a loss. It was an initiation, a transformation that turned him from a vulnerable novice into a hardened warrior. The intimacy between them was a rite of passage, designed to ensure loyalty and trust. Letters and inscriptions from the time show that these bonds were not temporary. They were enduring. A letter found at Dura Europos, written by a soldier to his mentor, speaks of longing, not just for his guidance, but for his presence. "My dearest Marcus," the letter reads, "your absence leaves a hole in my heart, one that even the eagle of Rome cannot fill." Another inscription, carved into the stone of a soldier's tomb, reads, "Under the watch of Mars, we were brothers. Bound by more than just battle, we were companions through fire and blood, in life and in death." These are not the words of men who had simply fought together. They are the words of men who had shared their bodies, their trust, and their loyalty in ways that transcended the battlefield. As these bonds grew, so did their significance. What was once a mentor-protege relationship became a model for every soldier in the legions. The younger soldiers learned that survival in the legions was not just about skill with a sword. It was about creating ties that went beyond the duties of war. Those who formed close, intimate bonds were stronger, more resilient. They fought not just for Rome, but for each other. This intimacy, though never spoken of in the official records, became one of the foundations of Roman military success. The psychological bond between soldiers gave them a strength that was unmatched. While enemies fought for their own survival, Roman soldiers fought for each other, willing to lay down their lives to protect the men they loved. Yet, the system was not without its darkness. The role of the passive partner in these relationships was not always consensual. The power imbalance in the legions, the rigid hierarchy, meant that some soldiers were forced into intimacy against their will. In the early days of the empire, there were few protections for those who were exploited in this way. The emperor's word may have been law, but the emperor's soldiers often lived by an unspoken code, one that protected the powerful and left the weak to fend for themselves. When abuse occurred, it was often hidden, beneath the guise of mentorship, silenced by the code of loyalty and the demands of war. The boundaries between love and control were constantly shifting. A recruit could not simply say no. To refuse was to risk everything. To submit was to endure a form of control, one that could either forge a stronger bond or leave a man broken. But, in the majority of cases, the bond between mentor and recruit was one of genuine affection, a bond that held the legions together through their darkest hours. Rome's greatest weapon was not its armies, its conquests, or its strategy. It was the loyalty between men, bound by something far more potent than law, something visceral, something human. Rome's legions, a force of relentless conquest, were also a society unto themselves, governed by an internal code far removed from the laws of the Republic. Within these fortresses, where men lived and died for each other, the concept of loyalty was not merely a matter of allegiance to the emperor. It was an allegiance to each other, built on a complex web of social, emotional, and yes, physical bonds. But while these bonds were essential for survival, they also existed within a system that demanded order, and that order, as always in Rome, was written in law. Rome's legal system was legendary for its sophistication, and it extended into the military with brutal precision. But when it came to matters of intimacy, the law was a curious blend of morality, pragmatism, and power dynamics. The military needed a structure to manage the affections that had blossomed between soldiers, just as it needed to maintain its grip on the bodies of its soldiers, the very instruments of conquest. So, it did what Rome did best. It codified everything, even desire. The Roman military's rules for intimacy were clear, though rarely spoken aloud. The laws of Rome did not forbid sexual relationships between soldiers, but they were governed by one important distinction: the active and the passive. A Roman soldier, particularly a higher-ranking officer like a centurion, could engage in relationships with lower-ranking soldiers. But the key was always the role played in the act. The active partner, the one who took control, retained his status, his honor, his Roman dignity. But the passive partner, who assumed the submissive role, faced a different reality. In Roman society, the passive man, no matter his status, was seen as losing some of his freeborn dignity. This dynamic was not limited to the military. It was a pervasive social norm that governed every interaction in Roman life. However, the passive partner in a mentorship relationship was not stripped of his dignity in the same way that a man from the lower classes would be. In the world of the legions, the passive role was an accepted part of military initiation, a necessary rite of passage into the world of warriors. This distinction between active and passive was also codified in law. Under the Lex Julia Devi Publica, any act of sexual violence, whether committed within the military or outside, could be punishable by death or exile. But this law only applied in certain circumstances, when a superior took advantage of a subordinate without the pretense of mentorship. As long as the older soldier was seen as a mentor and the younger one as the student, their relationship was treated differently by the legal system. The bond between them was seen not as a violation of Roman law, but as part of the natural order of military life. Rome's laws were based on hierarchy, a hierarchy not only of rank but of power, dominance, and submission. The active partner retained authority, while the passive partner was expected to submit, and in doing so, to learn and grow within the system. This dynamic was not just sexual. It was a mirror of the relationship between generals and soldiers, between commanders and their legions. Power was not given freely. It was something that had to be earned, wrested from those below. But this earned power came at a cost. Soldiers did not simply fight for land or glory. They fought for each other, bound together by the intimacy of shared pain and pleasure. And in doing so, they forged a loyalty stronger than any weapon. Yet, this loyalty was not unconditional. It was given, in exchange for something, for protection, for mentorship, for a place in the Roman hierarchy. And when the price of loyalty became too high, when the bonds between soldiers threatened to blur the line between affection and control, the empire intervened. Roman commanders were not blind to the emotional ties that formed between soldiers. They understood that men who shared intimacy also shared a bond that could not easily be broken. And so, they took steps to ensure that these bonds did not threaten the empire's absolute control. They codified intimacy, turning it into a tool that could be used to bind men together, but also to control them. One example of this can be found in the military reward system. The Roman army had a system of honors and privileges, not only for physical prowess, but also for loyalty. Soldiers who formed deep emotional connections with their comrades could be rewarded with positions of greater authority, with land, or even with money. In this way, emotional loyalty was formalized, made tangible in a way that could benefit the empire's interests. Yet the more loyalty Rome demanded, the more it asked of its soldiers. These men, bound by intimacy, by brotherhood, and by the call of duty, were also bound by the laws of Rome, laws that ensured their bodies, their emotions, and their loyalty would be used in service of the empire. The law was clear. Submission, when voluntary, was not a loss of dignity. It was a path to power. For the recruit, to submit to his mentor was to earn his place in the legions, to prove his worth as a soldier. But this submission came with its own costs, both physical and emotional. The moment a soldier submitted to another, he also submitted to the empire, to the greater power that governed his body, his all, and his fate. Rome's laws on sexual conduct were not about preventing intimacy, they were about controlling it. They were about ensuring that the bonds between men, forged in the fires of battle and love, would never challenge the empire's iron grip on power. Rome understood that control over the body was as important as control over land, and in the end, it was the control over the body, the absolute power to dictate who could touch whom, who could love whom, and who could dominate whom. That made Rome the most powerful empire in the world. In the shadow of the Roman legions, survival was not simply a matter of strength or skill. It was a matter of submission and trust, two elements that would bind soldiers to each other and to the empire. The training they underwent, both physical and emotional, was designed not just to sharpen their bodies, but to shape their very identities. Loyalty was forged not only in battle, but in the quiet, intimate moments that passed between soldiers in the barracks, where they learned that survival meant sharing everything: pain, sweat, fear, and, inevitably, love. To survive in the legions was to submit to a system of total obedience. Every soldier's body, from the curve of his spine to the flex of his muscles, was molded by the demands of Roman military discipline. But there was more to it than mere obedience. Rome's true weapon was not the sword, but the ability to transform individuals into extensions of the empire itself. The soldier's flesh was no longer his own. It belonged to the state, and to the men who shared his blood, sweat, and desires. The process of turning a civilian into a Roman soldier began the moment a recruit set foot in the camp. At first, the recruit was just a boy, inexperienced, vulnerable, full of hope and fear. He was given a uniform, a shield, and a spear. But more importantly, he was given a mentor, usually an older, more seasoned soldier, a centurion or veteran, whose role was to transform him into a warrior. This mentor was not just a teacher, he was a father, a protector, and, in many cases, something more. This bond between the recruit and his mentor was not one of mere instruction, but one of transformation. It was the mentor's responsibility to shape the recruit's body into the perfect instrument of war. But this transformation was never purely physical. The mentor's touch, whether in the form of a guiding hand on the recruit's shoulder or a harsh correction of posture, also shaped the recruit's mind. The mentor taught the recruit not just how to fight, but how to endure, how to suppress his desires, and how to obey without question. But within this rigid structure, something more subtle emerged: emotional and physical dependence. The recruit's survival depended on his mentor's approval and his mentor's affection. A recruit who failed to please his mentor, who failed to submit properly, was seen as weak. A recruit who succeeded, however, was rewarded not just with praise, but with something far more valuable: protection. Protection from the violence of battle, protection from the isolation of the camp, and perhaps most crucially, protection from the silence that plagued every Roman soldier. The physical training in the legions was brutal. Long marches, heavy armor, endless drills. The soldiers were shaped by their training until their muscles, their endurance, and their will were forged into an iron will. But it was the emotional training that was truly the most important. Rome's generals understood that a soldier could endure pain, even death, if he had something worth fighting for. And nothing was more valuable to a soldier than the bond he shared with his comrades. The bond between mentor and recruit was not merely emotional, it was often physical as well. In the cold of Germania, two soldiers might huddle together for warmth, sharing their body heat in a world that seemed determined to freeze them to death. In the heat of the Syrian desert, soldiers shared water and shade, bodies pressed together in a delicate balance between survival and intimacy. In these moments, intimacy was no longer a secret or a luxury. It was a necessity. The act of sharing warmth, sharing shelter, sharing life, created a bond that could not easily be broken. This bond, forged in the crucible of war, was what made the Roman army so formidable. But it was also a bond that, if it crossed the wrong boundaries, could lead to something darker. As soldiers grew accustomed to these close relationships, the lines between mentor and protege, commander and soldier, became increasingly blurred. What had begun as a necessary emotional and physical closeness turned into something more, a power dynamic that was not just about survival, but about control. The mentor became not only a teacher, but a gatekeeper of loyalty, a keeper of power. The recruit became not just a soldier, but a vessel for the empire's will, shaped by his mentor's touch. In some cases, these bonds became emotional and sexual. The mentor, once a father figure, became a lover. The recruit, once a vulnerable boy, became a man, his body and mind molded by the mentor's dominance and care. But even in these intimate moments, the dynamics of power remained. The mentor was always the active partner, always in control. The recruit was the passive one, the one who gave in, the one who submitted. But it wasn't just about power or sex. It was about survival. In the harshest moments, when the battle seemed lost or the camp seemed too cold to bear, it was these intimate bonds that held the soldiers together. They fought not for Rome, not for glory, but for the men beside them. The affection between them created a loyalty that was unmatched, a loyalty that transcended fear, that transcended law, and that transcended even the empire itself. Yet, this loyalty came at a cost. The mentor's dominance, the soldier's submission, these dynamics were not always voluntary. Some recruits were coerced into intimacy by the very system that had promised them protection. The desire for power, for belonging, could sometimes turn into something darker. In a world where loyalty was not just encouraged, but demanded, submission was often the price paid for survival. But even in the darker corners of the legions, loyalty could not be erased. For every soldier who submitted unwillingly, there were 10 who did so willingly, knowing that the price of loyalty was steep, but that the rewards, the protection, the bond, the trust, were worth it. And so the system continued, grinding men into warriors, shaping their bodies and minds to serve the empire. The bodies of soldiers were not just tools of war, they were tools of control. And in this system, loyalty, the kind that was forged through intimacy, through submission, through flesh, became the greatest weapon of all. In Rome, loyalty had a price. And in the legions, that price was paid in more than just gold. It was paid in bodies, in service, and in affection. The bonds forged in the heat of battle, in the quiet moments between soldiers, were not abstract notions. They were currency, exchanged in the form of protection, trust, and loyalty. And they would often be the key to a soldier's future. The Roman military was a well-oiled machine, its ranks filled with men from across the empire: Spaniards, Gauls, Greeks, and Egyptians, all united under one banner, one oath. But behind the discipline, behind the drills and the wars, a quieter economy existed. An economy based not on wealth or goods, but on personal loyalty and the bonds between soldiers. This economy shaped every aspect of life in the legions, from promotions to rewards and even to death. The bond between mentor and recruit was the foundation of this system. A recruit's survival depended not only on his ability to fight, but on his ability to form strong emotional connections. A soldier who was isolated, who failed to build loyalty with those around him, was vulnerable. A soldier who succeeded in forging these bonds, however, was guaranteed something more than just protection. He was guaranteed a future in the legions, and often a place in history. The reward for loyalty was not only in the form of affection or camaraderie, it was also a material one. The soldier who proved his loyalty, who showed his devotion to the empire and to his comrades, was often rewarded with land, wealth, and higher status. Soldiers were given small plots of land upon retirement, the premia, a reward for their years of service and loyalty. But loyalty could also be rewarded more immediately in the form of gifts, honors, or even positions of power. One of the most significant rewards for loyalty in the legions was the possibility of advancement. Soldiers who formed strong bonds with their commanders or with other soldiers of higher rank were often promoted, not based solely on skill in battle, but on their ability to maintain loyalty within the ranks. The closer the bond, the greater the trust. And with trust came power. In this way, loyalty was not just emotional, it was political. The bonds formed between soldiers were political currency, traded for rewards and influence. The higher the rank, the more loyalty was demanded, and the more loyalty had to be earned. For those who succeeded in forming these bonds, the rewards could be immense. For those who failed, the cost was high: isolation, disgrace, and sometimes death. Yet, loyalty was not only an internal economy, it also had a darker side. In a system built on hierarchy, submission could be just as powerful as loyalty. A soldier who submitted to the will of his commander, who obeyed without question, was often rewarded with protection and favor. But submission came with its own price. It meant the loss of autonomy, the loss of control over one's own body. And for many soldiers, this was a price they were willing to pay in exchange for security. In fact, it was the very submission of the recruit, his willingness to become emotionally and physically dependent on his mentor, that made him valuable to the Roman system. The recruit's submission ensured his loyalty, which in turn ensured his usefulness to the empire. A recruit who resisted the bonds of affection and mentorship was seen as a threat to the stability of the system, a potential dissenter who could disrupt the fragile balance of the legions. This transactional nature of loyalty and affection was embedded in every aspect of military life. Soldiers formed close relationships with each other, not just out of camaraderie, but out of necessity. The act of sharing personal intimacy, the bond that formed between men who depended on each other for survival, was not just a form of emotional connection. It was also a way of ensuring one's place within the larger social and military structure. The economy of affection extended beyond the battlefield. When soldiers retired, their loyalty to the empire was rewarded with land and status. But even after retirement, the bonds they formed in the legions would often continue to shape their lives. Former soldiers would return to the legions as veterans, often serving in civilian positions that had military connections. Or they would form veteran communities where they could continue to exert influence. These communities were often tightly knit, based on the same loyalty and bonds that had existed in the legions. Yet, the economy of affection wasn't only about the rewards soldiers could receive. It also had a darker, more sinister side. The power of Ramu loyalty was not always equally distributed. Some soldiers, particularly those of lower rank, had to pay a greater price for their place in the system. They were more likely to be forced into submission, to become the passive partner in the relationships of mentorship that governed military life. Their bodies were not just tools of war, but tools of control. The recruitment process was carefully designed to ensure that only the most loyal and submissive men rose through the ranks. Recruits who failed to form strong emotional bonds were often isolated or punished, their loyalty questioned. Those who succeeded in building relationships of affection and submission, however, were rewarded with a future in the empire, a future of land, wealth, and power. In this way, the empire used affection, submission, and loyalty not just as tools of control, but as tools of integration. The Roman army was not simply a force of warriors. It was a force of men bound together by a complex web of emotional and physical loyalty. And in the world of the legions, that loyalty was the ultimate currency. For the Romans, masculinity was not a state of being. It was a performance. It had to be proven, displayed, reaffirmed, again and again. The legionnaire was not born a man. He was made into one, forged in drills, sweat, and spectacle. Every scar, every muscle, every gesture was a declaration of worth. But in the close quarters of the fortress, where intimacy blurred with obedience, the question became more complex. How did a man prove his masculinity in a world where submission could also be a form of loyalty? How did he remain dominant while living in a system that demanded both control and surrender? Rome had an answer: ritual. Masculinity in the legions was not an abstract ideal. It was codified into behavior, into the daily routines that transformed soldiers into instruments of the state. The morning drills, the punishing endurance tests, the scars worn like medals. These were not only about training the body, they were about asserting control over it. A man who could master pain, who could turn suffering into discipline, proved his worth to the empire. But mastery over the body was only the beginning. The legions developed their own unspoken rituals to reaffirm the hierarchy between dominance and submission, a system that balanced affection with aggression, tenderness with brutality. After long campaigns or nights of shared intimacy, soldiers often participated in what modern historians have come to call rituals of restoration. These were not officially sanctioned by the empire, but they were widely practiced across the frontier camps. Small, physical ceremonies designed to restore a soldier's masculine identity after acts of emotional or physical vulnerability. They took many forms. Some were as simple as sparring matches between lovers. Two men grappling until one pinned the other to the ground, both laughing, both bleeding, both proving something unspoken. Others were more brutal. Mock duels fought with real blades, or tests of endurance, where one soldier struck another until he could no longer stand. It was not cruelty. It was a declaration, a way to balance the ledger between affection and dominance. The legion's graffiti and letters tell of such rituals with surprising frankness. One wall inscription found in a fortress along Hadrian's Wall reads, "After the night, the duel, Marcus struck, I bled, balance restored." Another, from a camp in Germania, depicts two soldiers wrestling beneath the inscription, "Brothers again." These were not mere pastimes. They were psychological necessities. The soldier's identity depended on maintaining the illusion of control, even when that control had been temporarily surrendered. After nights spent in intimacy, soldiers needed to reassert their roles, to reclaim the hierarchy that defined their world. Rome's moral code allowed this contradiction. To be a man in Rome was not to avoid submission entirely, but to master it, to decide when and why to yield, and to reclaim power through ritualized displays of strength. Submission, in this sense, was not humiliation, it was a test of endurance. A man who could endure domination without breaking, and then rise again in strength, was not weak, he was purified. The philosopher Seneca once wrote, "Pain is the proof of virtue, endurance the proof of manhood." The legions lived by that creed. The rituals that followed intimacy were, in essence, acts of purification. They reaffirmed that every wound, whether from battle or from affection, had meaning. To bleed for one's comrade, whether on the battlefield or in the barracks, was to share in the sacred fraternity of Rome. There was also a theatricality to it all. Military festivals, especially those dedicated to Mars, the god of war, often featured wrestling competitions, boxing matches, and feats of strength that blurred the line between violence and celebration. During the festival of Armilustrium, held each October to purify weapons and soldiers alike, troops performed combat dances with oil-slicked bodies. their movements both martial and sensual. The boundaries between ritual, religion, and desire dissolved under the red glow of torches. These performances were more than entertainment. They were social mechanisms that stabilized the legion's fragile masculinity. They allowed men to express emotion, affection, admiration, even love, through the language of combat. In a culture that denied softness, pain became the only acceptable form of tenderness. And yet, beneath these displays of virility, something deeper stirred. The same rituals meant to reinforce dominance sometimes blurred the very lines they sought to protect. Two men might begin a sparring match as comrades, only to end it with a lingering glance, their bruises serving as silent reminders of something more intimate than rivalry. The commanders, ever pragmatic, tolerated these contradictions. As long as discipline was maintained and the army functioned, what happened between soldiers remained unspoken. Rome's genius was its ability to convert even contradiction into order, to turn chaos into ritual. Over time, the rituals of masculinity became an integral part of Rome's military culture. Soldiers who had once been recruits learned to perform strength as naturally as they breathed. They flexed their power not just to intimidate enemies, but to reassure themselves that they were still men, that their bonds of affection had not stripped them of what society defined as honor. In truth, Rome had created a paradox. The same system that demanded absolute control also depended on emotional vulnerability. The legions were both temples of discipline and theaters of desire, and as long as the empire expanded, this delicate balance held. Love and violence marching side by side under the same eagle. But the more Rome institutionalized these rituals, the more it blurred the boundary between obedience and worship. Soldiers no longer fought merely for the empire. They fought for the sanctity of the bonds that defined their existence, bonds consecrated not by law, but by shared blood and pain. In Rome, the gods did not stand above the empire, they marched with it. Every victory, every act of conquest was both political and sacred. And nowhere was that union between power and divinity more visceral than in the cult of Mars, god of war. To the Romans, Mars was not merely a deity of destruction. He was the father of the people, the protector of order, the divine embodiment of discipline and virility. His festivals were not moments of reflection. They were explosions of controlled chaos, rituals where the empire sanctified its most primal instincts. What began as a private bond between soldiers, a touch, a shared cloak, a whispered promise, soon found its reflection in religion. Rome had always understood that control over bodies required control over souls. So, the empire transformed human desire into divine doctrine. Every October, the legions gathered for the Armilustrium, the purification of arms. Officially, it was a ceremony to cleanse weapons of blood before winter. In reality, it was something much older, much darker. The air filled with the smell of smoke and iron. Trumpets blared. Soldiers, stripped to the waist and oiled like athletes, circled their weapons as priests invoked Mars Gradivus, Mars the Marcher. What followed was half dance, half duel. Men fought in ritualized combat, their movements choreographed to mimic both battle and embrace. Each blow, each grapple was an offering. The bruises were blessings, the pain a sacrament. To bleed together before Mars was to renew one's bond not just with comrades, but with the Empire itself. Some accounts describe the soldiers' bodies glistening in torchlight, moving with a rhythm that blurred the line between aggression and seduction. The Romans did not separate the two. For them, to dominate was divine, and to be dominated was to serve the divine order. Desire and violence were not opposites. They were partners in the same sacred performance. The historian Frontinus once wrote that Mars delights not only in courage, but in unity. The cult of Mars gave Rome exactly that, a spiritual framework to justify what the body already craved, connection through power. Other festivals blurred the same boundaries. During Lupercalia, held each February, priests known as Luperci ran naked through the streets, striking bystanders, especially women, with strips of goat hide to ensure fertility. But in the military camps, Lupercalia took a different form. Soldiers replaced the goat hides with leather thongs and struck one another across the back, laughing, shouting invocations to Mars and Venus alike. Pain became celebration, dominance, a prayer. And then there was Saturnalia, the great inversion of order. For a single week in December, hierarchy dissolved. Masters served slaves. Soldiers mocked their commanders. The legions embraced freedom, indulgence, and excess. What began as laughter often ended in ecstasy. Archaeological evidence from frontier forts, piles of discarded amphorae, murals of feasting and embrace, shows that Saturnalia was as much a festival of the flesh as of the spirit. To outsiders, it may have seemed chaotic, even obscene. But to Rome, these moments were essential. They were the pressure valves of empire, controlled eruptions of pleasure and defiance that reinforced obedience the rest of the year. By allowing soldiers to indulge desire under divine sanction, Rome transformed rebellion into ritual. The empire's genius was not to suppress the instincts of its soldiers, but to redirect them. By binding lust and loyalty under the name of Mars, it ensured that every heartbeat, every impulse, served the state. Even pleasure became patriotic. Religious artifacts confirm this fusion. Statuettes of Mars, found in military shrines, often depict him nude, a rarity among Roman gods. His spear rising in both martial and erotic symbolism. Inscriptions dedicate not only victories, but the endurance of brotherhood to the god. One votive tablet from Carnuntum reads, "To Mars, for the strength of our bond and the courage of our knights." Rome had transformed intimacy into ritual, and ritual into theology. What had once been whispered between lovers in the barracks was now sung by choirs of priests. The empire had sanctified desire, not as sin, but as structure. Through the cult of Mars, the legions learned that their bodies were not their own. Every touch, every act of love or violence was part of something larger, a choreography of obedience, repeated across continents. The empire expanded not just through conquest, but through ritualized faith in domination itself. This was Rome's most brilliant illusion, that submission could feel holy, that pain could feel purposeful. Soldiers who bled for Mars did not see themselves as victims. They saw themselves as chosen, consecrated through flesh to serve eternity. And yet, beneath the hymns and incense, a quiet truth pulsed like a hidden vein. Devotion and desire could not be perfectly controlled. Once sanctified, they acquired a power of their own, a loyalty no emperor could command and no law could extinguish. For the first time, Rome's spiritual machinery risked something dangerous. The soldiers who worshipped Mars did not just serve the empire. Some began to believe they were the empire, the living embodiment of its divine will. Every empire has a threshold, a point where devotion becomes dependency and loyalty becomes control. For Rome's legions, that threshold was crossed in silence. The same system that had bound men together through affection, ritual, and faith began to devour its own. Intimacy, once sacred, became a tool of coercion. What had started as brotherhood now became hierarchy of the flesh, a structure where love could no longer be distinguished from domination. By the 1st century CE, reports of abuse within the legions had become impossible to ignore. Not the kind written in chronicles, but whispered in barracks and recorded later on scraps of parchment found in the dust of forgotten forts. They tell of centurions who used mentorship as a mask for possession, who treated the young recruits not as students, but as spoils of war. The Lex Julia Divi Publica, Rome's law against sexual violence and coercion, theoretically extended even to the army. But in practice, its reach stopped at the gates of the fortress. Inside, commanders were the law. And when law becomes a man, justice becomes optional. In theory, a soldier could appeal to higher authority. In reality, doing so meant death, not by sentence, but by isolation. A soldier who broke silence betrayed not just his superior, but the entire code of brotherhood. Rome's most efficient form of control was not the lash, but shame. The fortress was a world built on silence. Every abuse, every humiliation was folded into the discipline that made the legion strong. The same rituals that celebrated loyalty also erased individuality. The body that belonged to the empire could no longer belong to itself. Archaeologists have found evidence of this quiet brutality. In the ruins of Dura Europos, a graffiti scratched into the plaster of a barrack wall reads, "He was my brother until night fell." Another from Vindolanda bears only a name, half erased, as though carved in defiance, then scraped away by morning. These fragments, like ghosts, hint at a violence too personal for official record. The abuse often followed a pattern. A young recruit would arrive, isolated, anxious, desperate to belong. His centurion, a decorated veteran, would offer guidance, food, and protection. Over time, mentorship turned into control. The recruit's body became part of the centurion's reward, another symbol of rank, another conquest. The empire never sanctioned it, but neither did it stop it. To Rome, what mattered was loyalty, not consent. The contradiction was staggering. An empire that could codify everything, taxes, land, punishment, had no language for what happened between men in the dark. And so, Rome's silence became complicity. Even when scandals reached the ears of emperors, they were handled not as moral crimes, but as logistical failures. When Augustus reformed the army, his concern was not ethics, but efficiency. When Tiberius investigated the rape of recruits in a camp near Pannonia, his orders were not to punish the guilty, but to restore discipline. The victims were relocated, the officers promoted. Rome rewarded control, not justice. But every system built on silence eventually fractures. By the 2nd century CE, letters from provincial governors began to hint at unrest, small desertions, unexplained suicides, men who vanished into forests rather than return to camp. The empire called them cowards. But in the soil of those forests, archaeologists have found makeshift altars, sometimes bearing 2 names carved side by side. These were not deserters. They were escapees, men who had fled a system that claimed both their loyalty and their bodies. Even within the rituals of Mars, the tone began to change. What once had been a celebration of unity took on an edge of desperation. Songs once dedicated to strength began to sound like confessions. One fragmentary hymn recovered from an Egyptian papyrus reads, "We bleed for him who commands us. We love him whom we fear." That line, "We love him whom we fear," captures the essence of Rome's great paradox. The legions were built on devotion, but that devotion was extracted through fear. The soldiers worshipped Mars because they could not defy him. They loved their commanders because they could not escape them. And yet, even within this darkness, small acts of resistance survived. Graffiti that mocked officers, letters written in coded language between lovers separated by orders, testaments leaving inheritance not to family, but to "my dearest companion." These were not rebellions of swords, but of memory. Attempts to reclaim identity within an empire that sought to erase it. The empire endured for centuries because it understood a simple truth. Power survives not through force, but through intimacy. To command a man's obedience, you must first command his affection. Rome perfected that equation, until it collapsed under its own moral weight. For when power enters the body, it leaves no visible wound, only scars that time must excavate. And beneath the stone floors of the fortresses, those scars remain. Bones buried in pairs, names joined on tombs, tokens of affection buried beneath the empire's silence. What Rome called discipline, history might call something else. A vast organized act of possession. When the wars ended, Rome did not simply leave its veterans behind. It lived inside them. For a legionnaire, discharge was supposed to be liberation. 25 years of service, and he would finally receive his praemia. A pension of land or gold, enough to start a quiet life. But what no scroll of law recorded was the truth every soldier knew. The empire never truly released them. After years of submission to order, to hierarchy, to the rhythm of command, freedom felt like exile. The fortress walls that had once confined them had also defined them. Without the sound of marching boots or the sharp bark of orders, silence became unbearable. For many veterans, the true war began the day they put down their swords. Across the provinces, from Hispania to Syria, retired soldiers built small communities on the lands Rome had granted them. They were called coloniae, miniature echoes of the empire's discipline. The streets were laid out like military camps. The veterans rose at dawn, drilled their sons, and kept their weapons clean long after they had no wars left to fight. Rome's order persisted in their gestures, their speech, their bodies. But what the empire had carved deepest into them was not discipline, it was intimacy. Many of these men had formed bonds stronger than blood, forged in years of shared battle and silence. When the legions disbanded, they faced an impossible question. What happens to a love that was born in the barracks, beneath the law of Mars, when the gods of war fall silent? The answer, for some, was denial. Veterans married local women, built homes, and buried the past under the routines of civilian life. But letters and tombs tell another story, one of longing, secrecy, and quiet persistence. In the colony of Emerita Augusta, archaeologists found a joint burial from the 2nd century. 2 men interred side by side, their epitaph reading, "Companions in war, joined in peace." Nearby lay a pair of rings, identical except for the engraving inside, one reading Fides, faith, the other Memoria, memory. They were not anomalies. Inscriptions across the empire repeat the same refrain. Soldiers who had once shared tents now shared homes. Some called each other brothers, others partners. A few were bold enough to use the word amor. These veterans did not think of themselves as rebels. They were, in their own way, continuing the rituals that had given their lives structure. They ate together, drank together, celebrated the birthdays of fallen comrades. Their households often included other former soldiers, men who had served in the same cohort or under the same commander. To outsiders, they looked like fraternities of old warriors. To themselves, they were families. Rome, for all its obsession with order, did not know what to do with these families. Officially, they did not exist. The law recognized wives and children, but not the quiet domestic partnerships that filled the veterans' colonies. Yet, as long as taxes were paid and fields were tended, the empire looked away. Tolerance was Rome's favorite disguise for indifference, but indifference has consequences. Many veterans found themselves caught between 2 worlds: the civilian peace that demanded they forget, and the martial brotherhood that refused to die. Their nights were restless. Dreams returned in flashes of torchlight, in the heat of another man's breath, in the memory of commands shouted over blood and rain. The body remembered what the mind tried to bury. Psychologists today might call it trauma. The Romans called it furor, the madness of warriors who could not shed the war from their bones. Some veterans tried to exorcise it by building shrines. Small household altars dedicated to Mars have been found in Homer miles from any battlefield. Offerings of wine, incense, and sometimes a ring or necklace left by a companion long dead. Worship became remembrance, and remembrance an act of defiance. Others turned their shared trauma into ritual. In the veteran associations known as Collegia Militum, men gathered each year to commemorate fallen comrades. They feasted, sang, and drank until dawn. These were not mere reunions. They were revivals of the barracks, the only place where they still felt whole. Some of these meetings ended in brawls, others in tears. The empire called it loyalty. In truth, it was grief that refused to fade. The emotional economy of the legions did not die with the wars. It migrated from camps to colonies, from command to memory. Even love itself had changed form. No longer ritualized under the eye of Mars, it now had to survive in secrecy. A glance exchanged at market, a shared meal that lasted too long, 2 graves placed too close together. The empire, as always, adapted. The church would later inherit Rome's obsession with control over the body, but twist it into something moral rather than military. What had once been devotion to Mars became sin against God. What had once been loyalty became shame. The language changed, but the purpose remained: to regulate the human need for connection. And yet, across centuries, the bones resist. In burial grounds from Britain to Judea, archaeologists have found paired interments, men buried together as equals, their epitaphs written not in command, but in tenderness. The empire that once measured loyalty in blood left behind a quieter record, one of touch, of care, of love disguised as duty. Rome had taught them that to serve was to surrender the body. But when the empire withdrew, what remained was not surrender, it was remembrance. Because the war never truly ends for the conquered or the conqueror, it merely changes language. The empire falls, the banners fade, but the bonds between men, those remain, whispering through the soil that once drank their blood. Empires collapse, but systems of control rarely die. They adapt. When Rome's banners fell, its legions did not vanish into dust. They became memory, ritual, inheritance. Their discipline survived not in governments, but in the minds of men who had been trained to worship order. And from that memory came a new kind of warrior, one who no longer fought for an emperor, but for God. By the 11th century, the echo of the Roman legionnaire resounded inside the stone walls of medieval monasteries and crusader fortresses. The structure was the same: hierarchy, obedience, celibacy, ritual. The chain of command had simply been baptized. What had once been the castra, the Roman military camp, was reborn as the commandery. The oath to the emperor became a vow to Christ. The same machinery that had bound men to empire now bound them to faith. The medieval knightly orders, the Templars, the Hospitallers, the Teutonic Knights, were Rome resurrected under a different god. They combined two things the empire had perfected: military precision and sacred purpose. Yet, beneath the prayers, beneath the armor marked with crosses, the psychology was hauntingly familiar. The vows of obedience, poverty, and chastity were not meant to liberate the soul, they were designed to own it. A Templar's day mirrored that of a Roman legionary. He rose at dawn, prayed at fixed hours, ate in silence, and trained in the art of war. He slept in dormitories, shoulder to shoulder with his brothers, forbidden from private possessions or private desires. But like the Roman soldier, his life was saturated with proximity. Constant touch, constant presence, constant suppression. Where the legions had Mars, the orders had Christ. Where the Roman camps had barrack rituals, the monasteries had prayers. But the emotional function was identical. Obedience replaced intimacy, or so the church claimed. Yet, human nature is more resilient than dogma. Within the brotherhoods, bonds formed, deep, secret, and often dangerous. The church called these bonds caritas, spiritual love. But within the cloisters, it often took on a more physical form. Chronicles from the 13th century hint at unholy affections between knights, monks, or companions at arms. What Rome had ritualized under Mars, the Church now moralized under sin. Yet the pattern endured, because the structure of devotion had already been written in the body. A knight's initiation into an order bore eerie resemblance to a Roman rite. The ceremony of becoming a Templar, for instance, began with the initiate kneeling before the master, swearing absolute obedience until death or command. He surrendered his wealth, his freedom, and symbolically, his flesh. His hair was cut, his clothes were changed. He was, in essence, reborn, not as a man, but as a weapon sanctified by faith. In this transformation, echoes of the old empire rang clear. Rome had demanded submission in exchange for belonging. The orders demanded the same, only now the submission was framed as holiness. To disobey was no longer treason, it was heresy. The rituals of purification continued too. Medieval chroniclers describe the flagellation ceremonies of certain orders, men whipping each other's backs in penance, their blood staining the floor like offerings. They called it mortification of the flesh, but the symbolism was ancient. Pain as purification, obedience as ecstasy. It was Mars disguised in the robes of Christ. Even the architecture carried the legacy. Monastic commanderies were laid out like Roman forts. Quadrangular courtyards, straight corridors, sleeping halls built in rows. The Roman logic of control through symmetry persisted for centuries. The geometry of power had become sacred design. And in this sanctified geometry, intimacy continued to find its place. Letters between crusaders often read like the same fragile confessions unearthed from Roman camps centuries earlier. One knight wrote to his companion during the siege of Acre, "Your absence is my punishment. The sound of your voice would be stronger than any prayer." Another chronicler, Jean de Joinville, described how crusaders kissed each other before battle so that each man might die less alone. The language had changed, but the meaning had not. Even in death, the pattern endured. Graves from the Crusader states sometimes contain pairs of knights buried side by side, their hands positioned as if touching through the stone. The Church's official doctrine condemned such closeness, but the bones beneath the cathedrals still whispered Rome's secret. Power built through intimacy cannot be unlearned. By the late Middle Ages, this structure of sacred brotherhood had permeated Europe's moral and political DNA. Monarchs adopted the same oaths of loyalty. Guilds mimicked the same hierarchies. Even modern armies would inherit the Roman balance between discipline and devotion. The empire had fallen, but its emotional architecture survived, hidden inside every institution that claimed to honor duty above self. Rome's greatest conquest was not territorial, it was psychological. It taught the world that the most obedient armies are not those ruled by fear, but those united by love. Love redefined, ritualized, weaponized. The monks called it piety, the knights called it honor. The emperors had called it discipline. But in every age, the logic remained the same. To control a man completely, make him believe his surrender is sacred. Empires fall. But systems of control, especially those built inside the human heart, do not collapse with their walls. They migrate, they adapt. They hide in the language of loyalty, of love, of faith. Rome understood this long before any philosopher wrote it down. The greatest empire is not built on land or gold, it is built on consent. And consent, Rome learned, could be engineered. When we look back at the Roman legions, their discipline, their devotion, their unbreakable unity, it is easy to mistake them for machines. But beneath the armor and order was something far more complex, an emotional architecture designed to merge the private and the political, to make the desires of men serve the desires of the state. In that design, Rome achieved something no empire before or since has mastered. It discovered the psychology of obedience. The philosopher Epictetus once said that no man is free unless he masters himself. Rome rewrote that idea. No man is free unless the state masters him. The army was the laboratory where that philosophy was perfected. Every rule, every punishment, every forbidden pleasure was a lesson in how to make submission feel like purpose. The brilliance of Rome's system was that it never fought human nature, it harnessed it. The need for belonging, the hunger for affection, the ecstasy of pain and recognition, all were redirected into the machinery of control. When two soldiers embraced, they reinforced not only each other's will to live, but the empire's will to expand. In modern terms, Rome turned intimacy into infrastructure. We often imagine power as something external, a sword, a throne, a decree. But Rome's power was internal. It lived in the bodies of men who had learned to equate obedience with love, discipline with devotion, and pain with purification. From this transformation came a philosophy that outlasted the empire itself. If you can possess a person's body, you can possess his soul. But if you can make him offer his body willingly, you will possess his soul forever. That is why Rome's legacy survived through Christianity, through chivalric orders, through modern armies and ideologies. The names changed, but the pattern did not. The church called it faith. The generals called it duty. Nations later called it patriotism. But beneath the rhetoric, the equation remained the same: sanctify submission, and you will never need to enforce it. Rome's conquest was never merely territorial, it was moral. It colonized the idea of obedience itself. And once obedience becomes a virtue, freedom becomes sin. Consider how the empire defined purity. In its temples, in its legions, even in its laws, purity was not about abstaining from corruption. It was about channeling corruption into service. A soldier's pain was not wasted. It was recycled into valor. A citizen's silence was not suppression. It was discipline. The empire absorbed every contradiction and turned it into order. That is the secret of its endurance. Rome did not suppress chaos. It organized it. The moral cost of that organization still echoes in our world. Every institution that demands devotion without question, every flag that replaces empathy with hierarchy, carries a trace of Rome's design. Every time love is measured in sacrifice, every time obedience is rewarded more than thought, the empire breathes again. We are its inheritors. Our laws still carry its logic. Our languages still whisper its metaphors of command and purity. Even our religions, the very systems that claim to transcend empire, were shaped by its bones. The concept of sin as defilement, of salvation through surrender, of devotion expressed through the body, all are Roman inventions, refined through theology. 2,000 years later, the question remains: can love exist where obedience is demanded? Can faith coexist with freedom? Or must one always consume the other? Rome's story does not give an answer, but it does leave a warning. In the ruins of Vindolanda, archaeologists found a small bronze plaque. It bears an inscription so faint it was almost missed. He obeyed because he loved. He loved because he was told. 6 words. An epitaph for a soldier, a creed for an empire. That is the ultimate price of Rome's perfection. It created men who could no longer tell where love ended and duty began. And that, perhaps, is why its ghosts endure. Because every system that seeks to last forever must learn what Rome mastered, to live inside its subjects, not above them, to shape desire until it can no longer tell the difference between freedom and faith. The Roman Empire may have crumbled, its statues fallen, its gods renamed. But the architecture of control, the transformation of intimacy into obedience, of tenderness into structure, survives wherever power demands to be loved. So when we look at the ruins, we are not just seeing history, we are seeing a mirror. For in every age, from legion to nation, from altar to barrack, from cross to crown, the same whisper returns: serve, obey, surrender, and call it devotion. If you value the record, subscribe. Because when the ledger closes, the bones still speak.